The left high kick, the most feared weapon in MMA history. Mirko Cro Cop Filipović was the nightmare every opponent prayed they'd never face. A national hero, a pride legend, and one of the most terrifying strikers the sport has ever seen. But now, at 50 years old, Cro Cop has finally revealed the price of all that violence. His body is broken, his mind scarred, and his life far darker than the glory days that made him a myth. This is the story of the rise, the reign, the fall, and the dark truth. Mirko Cro Cop has confessed about his life today. To understand Mirko Cro Cop Filipović, you have to understand where he came from. And it wasn't the bright lights of Tokyo or Las Vegas. It was the war-torn streets of Vinkovci, Croatia, in the shadow of the Yugoslav wars. Born in 1974, Mirko grew up in a country fractured by violence, where survival wasn't guaranteed, and young men learned the meaning of fear long before they learned to dream. While most children his age thought of games or sports, Mirko's childhood was underscored by air raid sirens, military convoys, and the grim reality of a nation at war. As he grew, Mirko's natural strength and discipline stood out. Unlike many fighters whose journeys start with athletic programs or martial arts schools, Mirko's first battleground was his homeland. He entered Croatia's anti-terrorism unit, the Lučko Anti-Terrorist Unit, one of the most elite forces in the nation. There, his body and mind were sharpened for war, not sport. While other fighters trained for competitions, Mirko trained for survival. He wasn't learning to fight to win points. He was learning to neutralize threats, to end conflicts swiftly and violently. But even within this crucible of real-world combat, Mirko had a burning ambition. He was fascinated by boxing and kickboxing, finding in the ring a different kind of battlefield, one where the violence was contained, the stakes personal, and the glory tangible. By his late teens, he had already begun training as a kickboxer, developing the thunderous legs that would one day terrify the fighting world. His body, lean and muscular, was sculpted not just by training, but by military drills, discipline, and the constant demand of readiness. What made Cro Cop unique was this dual identity, soldier by day, fighter by night. He would train relentlessly after long military shifts, balancing national duty with personal ambition. This duality forged not just his fighting style, but his persona, cold, efficient, merciless. The same man who carried out counter-terrorism operations now carried those instincts into the gym, where sparring partners quickly realized they weren't facing a normal athlete. They were facing a man conditioned to see combat as life and death. By the early 1990s, Mirko was no longer just a soldier who trained on the side. He was becoming a true martial artist, channeling his wartime discipline into the precision of striking. But the world would not meet him yet. For now, he was still a shadow, a soldier in Croatia with a dream of violence on a much bigger stage. By the mid-1990s, Mirko Cro Cop was no longer just a Croatian soldier who fought on the side. He was beginning to carve his path into professional combat sports. His entry into the prestigious K1 kickboxing circuit in Japan was nothing short of seismic. This was the proving ground for the most elite strikers on earth, where legends like Ernesto Hust, Peter Ertz, and Jerome Le Banner ruled. For Cro Cop, a man from war-torn Croatia, it was a chance to test himself against the world's deadliest fighters. From the moment he stepped into the K1 ring, it was clear Cro Cop was different. Tall, muscular, and with an icy demeanor, he didn't play to the crowd or smile for the cameras. He walked into the ring like he was reporting for duty. His style was raw but terrifying, a crisp left straight, devastating body kicks, and most of all, the weapon that would define his career, the left high kick. Delivered with terrifying speed and accuracy, it could end fights in an instant. Soon, the phrase was born. Right leg, hospital. Left leg, cemetery. In K1, Cro Cop went toe-to-toe with the very best, earning victories over decorated champions and earning respect in a world dominated by Dutch and Japanese giants. His highlight reels grew, filled with explosive knockouts that showcased the sheer violence of his striking. But beyond the technique, it was his aura that set him apart. Cro Cop wasn't just fighting, he was hunting. His stare was cold, his demeanor detached. To his opponents, it felt less like sport and more like survival against a predator. Despite his growing reputation, Cro Cop's time in K1 was also marked by challenges. challenges. He didn't win the coveted K1 World Grand Prix, often falling short against the sport's most experienced veterans. Yet every time he entered the ring, he left an impression, a dangerous newcomer with military discipline and a killer's instinct. And while K1 made him a star, Cro Cop was restless. He wasn't content with just being feared in kickboxing. He wanted to test himself in a new frontier, the chaotic, unpredictable, and rapidly growing world of mixed martial arts. When Mirko Cro Cop stepped into the Pride Fighting Championships in Japan, the world of MMA was already buzzing with anticipation. Here was a decorated K1 striker, a man whose kicks were feared across the globe, now entering a sport where anything could happen. Submissions, wrestling, chaos on the ground. For some, it was a risky move. For Cro Cop, it was the ultimate challenge. His early MMA fights were raw, sometimes awkward. Grapplers exposed his inexperience on the ground, and wrestlers tried to drag him into unfamiliar territory. But even in those early struggles, one thing was undeniable. If the fight stayed standing, Cro Cop was a nightmare. His striking wasn't just effective, it was lethal. Unlike other strikers who adjusted slowly to MMA, Cro Cop carried his K1 power directly into the cage, and it worked. Then came Pride FC, the perfect stage for Cro Cop's brand of violence. Pride was not just a fighting promotion, it was a spectacle, a theater of chaos, where gladiators became demigods, and Cro Cop fit right in. In the massive arenas of Japan, in front of tens of thousands of fans, he walked out to the ring like an executioner approaching the gallows. His cold stare, his military background, his reputation, it all created an aura of terror. Fighters admitted privately that they feared him before the fight even began. Inside the ring, Cro Cop delivered on that fear. Knockouts came brutally and suddenly. Igor Vovchanchin, Wanderlei Silva, Alexander Emelianenko, they all fell to the Croatian's precision and power. His left high kick became the most feared weapon in MMA. The sound of Cro Cop's shin crashing into an opponent's skull was unforgettable. And unlike many strikers, Cro Cop didn't need to throw dozens of shots. He waited, patient and calculating, before unleashing hell in a single strike. For years, Cro Cop became Pride's most terrifying striker. Fans in Japan revered him as a dark hero, the silent executioner who embodied both discipline and destruction. Commentators described his presence as chilling. His opponents described it as suffocating. Cro Cop wasn't just another fighter. He was the embodiment of fear itself. And yet, beneath the dominance, cracks were forming. He was winning, yes, but the wars were piling up. Each brutal knockout added to his legend, but also chipped away at his body. The executioner was rising to mythic status, but the seeds of tragedy were already being sown. If Cro Cop's arrival in Pride made him a star, his rivalries made him a legend. Pride Fighting Championships was a place where matchups were larger than life, where fighters weren't just athletes, but mythic figures. And Mirko found himself in the center of some of the most iconic battles in MMA history. One of his greatest rivalries came against Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Big Nog, the indomitable Brazilian grappler who seemed impossible to finish. Cro Cop versus Nogueira was the perfect clash of styles. The cold, merciless striker against the warm, unbreakable jiu-jitsu master. Their first fight in 2003 was a war. Cro Cop dominated early, battering Nogueira with his precision striking, nearly finishing him. But Nogueira, as he had done so many times, weathered the storm, pulled Cro Cop into deep water, and in a stunning reversal, submitted him in the second round. The loss was devastating for Cro Cop, but it also elevated his myth. He had shown the full force of his striking, yet fell to a man who simply would not quit. For fans, it was one of the greatest MMA fights of all time. Another rivalry was with Wanderlei Silva, the axe murderer. Both men were symbols of violence, both feared, both unrelenting. When they finally clashed in Pride, the anticipation was electric. Fans knew it wasn't going to be a technical chess match. It was going to be war, and war it was. The fight was brutal. bloody, and unforgettable, ending in a draw, but leaving behind some of the most iconic images in MMA history. Years later, they would meet again, and this time, Cro Cop would not be denied, knocking out Silva with the very weapon he was famous for, the left high kick. That victory cemented his place as one of Pride's most feared finishers. But Cro Cop's true crowning achievement came in 2006 during the Pride Openweight Grand Prix. It was one of the most ambitious tournaments in MMA history, pitting fighters of all sizes and styles against each other. Cro Cop stormed through the tournament, destroying opponents with ruthless efficiency. In the finals, he faced Josh Barnett, the hulking American wrestler. The fight ended with Cro Cop brutalizing Barnett with strikes, forcing a corner stoppage. The image of Cro Cop standing victorious, finally crowned as a Pride champion, was the culmination of years of blood, sacrifice, and obsession. Yet even at his peak, the wars were taking their toll. The rivalries that built his legend were also breaking his body. Every knockout, every brawl, every war added to his myth, but also chipped away at the man behind it. By 2007, Mirko Cro Cop was a global name. Fans in Japan saw him as a warrior poet of violence, and the Western MMA audience was desperate to see him in the UFC. When the announcement was made, it was seismic. The executioner was coming to America. The hype was overwhelming. This was supposed to be Cro Cop's second conquest, the final stage of his legacy. His UFC debut was against Eddie Sanchez, a journeyman fighter who was clearly meant as a showcase for Cro Cop's arrival. And it went exactly as expected. Cro Cop overwhelmed him with his striking, knocking him out in the first round. Fans were convinced the legend was here, and soon he would take over the heavyweight division. But what happened next remains one of the most shocking moments in UFC history. Cro Cop faced Gabriel Gonzaga in his second fight, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu specialist who was expected to try and drag him to the ground. But instead, Gonzaga stunned the world. Late in the first round, Gonzaga unleashed a thunderous head kick, Cro Cop's own signature weapon, and knocked him out cold. The image of Cro Cop crumpling backward, his leg grotesquely twisted beneath him, became one of the UFC's most iconic knockouts. For Cro Cop, it was not just a loss. It was humiliation. The very strike that made him famous was now the instrument of his downfall. From that moment, his UFC career never recovered. He won some fights, but the aura of invincibility was gone. In Japan, fighters feared him before the fight even began. In the UFC, he looked human. The cage felt different, the rules were different, and perhaps most importantly, Cro Cop himself was different. Years of brutal wars had already broken down his body. His speed was fading, his reflexes dulled, and his invincibility shattered. The UFC was supposed to be his grand conquest. Instead, it became the chapter where fans began to see the mortality of the myth. No longer the unstoppable executioner, Cro Cop was now a man showing cracks, and those cracks would only widen. By the late 2000s and into the 2010s, Mirko Cro Cop was no longer the same fighter who terrorized Pride. His record showed wins and losses, but the deeper truth was written on his body. Decades of combat in K1 rings, Pride tournaments, and UFC cages had left him battered beyond repair. One of the most shocking aspects of Cro Cop's decline was the sheer number of injuries and surgeries he endured. His knees were destroyed, forcing multiple operations. His nose had been broken so many times that breathing became difficult. Scar tissue above his eyes made it so he was cut open in nearly every fight. By his mid-30s, Cro Cop's face looked like it had been sculpted by violence. Doctors eventually had to reconstruct parts of it. His nose was rebuilt, his scar tissue surgically removed. Even pieces of cartilage were grafted to give him basic function again. In interviews, Cro Cop admitted that after years of damage, even daily activities had become a struggle. He couldn't sleep properly. He couldn't breathe properly. His body, once a weapon of destruction, was now a prison of pain. Yet, despite this, he kept fighting. The fighter's mentality, the the refusal to quit drove him back into the ring again and again. Each comeback was met with flashes of brilliance, but also brutal reminders that time and trauma had already won. Fans noticed the changes. The cold, terrifying stare was still there, but the explosiveness was gone. The aura of death that once surrounded him had been replaced by something else, vulnerability, and yet he refused to stop. Even as doctors patched his body together, even as surgeries left him scarred and weakened, Cro Cop could not walk away from the fight, but the body can only endure so much. In 2019, the years of punishment finally caught up with him in the most devastating way possible. Cro Cop's body broke not in the ring, but in life itself, when he suffered a stroke that nearly ended everything. For years, Mirko Cro Cop had walked a dangerous line. He had pushed his body beyond its limits, fought through injuries that would have ended lesser careers, and returned to the cage time and time again despite doctors' warnings. But in 2019, the fight finally caught up with him. And it happened not in front of the cameras, not in the roaring stadiums of Japan or Las Vegas, but quietly, terrifyingly, in his private life. It started with dizziness. Mirko, a man who had endured the heaviest punches and the most brutal knockouts, felt weakness and disorientation. Soon, he collapsed and was rushed to the hospital. The diagnosis? A stroke. For a fighter who had made a career out of walking into violence and surviving, this was something he could not fight his way out of. The stroke didn't just end his career, it nearly ended his life. Doctors told him in no uncertain terms, if he fought again, it could kill him. The years of trauma, the endless wars, the repeated head strikes, the stress on his body, it had all culminated in this. His brain had finally cried out for mercy. The stroke was the final verdict, the one battle Mirko Cro Cop could not win. For fans, the news was heartbreaking. They had seen Cro Cop fall before, but always with the belief that he would rise again. This time, there was no comeback. He announced his retirement, not with the pride of a champion leaving on top, but with the sobering reality that continuing could take his life. For a man who had built his legacy on fearlessness, it was the first time the world saw him vulnerable, mortal, human. In interviews afterward, Cro Cop admitted just how close he had come to death. He confessed that his body had been breaking for years, that he had ignored countless warnings, that he had fought when he shouldn't have. And now, the price was clear. The stroke changed everything, not just his career, but his perspective. For the first time, Mirko Cro Cop, the executioner who had once terrified the world, was forced to confront his own fragility. Today, at 50 years old, Mirko Cro Cop lives not as the executioner, not as the destroyer of men, but as a survivor. The man who once stood in packed arenas, his stare enough to make opponents wilt, now faces a far different reality. And in recent years, he has finally begun to speak openly about the price he has paid. The dark truth is simple. His body is broken. Years of surgeries have left scars across his face and body. His knees, once explosive weapons, now ache with every step. His nose, rebuilt multiple times, serves as a reminder of the endless wars. The scar tissue that doctors scraped away gave him a second chance to breathe, but not a second chance to fight. Beyond the physical, there are deeper wounds. Cro Cop has admitted to memory problems, mood swings, and the creeping shadow of cognitive decline, the same symptoms that plague many fighters after decades of trauma. He has spoken candidly about the toll that fighting took on him, not just in the ring, but in the years afterward. The fans saw the knockouts, the glory, the highlight reels. What they didn't see were the sleepless nights, the headaches, the moments of forgetting, the private struggles. At 50, Cro Cop's days of being the executioner are over, and in their place stands a man who has been forced to acknowledge his fragility. He has said plainly, fighting cost him more than he ever imagined. While he remains proud of his achievements, he has also revealed the regret, the knowledge that he gave too much of himself to a sport that took everything it could from him. There is also the haunting awareness of legacy. Cro Cop has spoken about the younger generation of fighters and the dangers they too will face. He knows the cycle will repeat. The sport rewards violence, but it does not protect its heroes from the consequences. His message now, as he reflects on his own condition, is a warning. Greatness comes with a price, and that price may be far too high. The dark truth Mirko Cro Cop has revealed is that behind the highlight reels and the aura of invincibility lies a man who lives every day with the cost of his choices. He is no longer feared, no longer unstoppable. He is human, and that is perhaps the hardest reality of all. Mirko Cro Cop's career spanned more than 2 decades, across 2 combat sports, and left behind a trail of unforgettable moments. On paper, his record speaks volumes: dozens of knockouts, championships in both kickboxing and MMA, and a Pride Openweight Grand Prix title that stands as one of the greatest tournament victories in history. But Cro Cop's legacy cannot be measured by numbers alone. His legacy is fear. No fighter in MMA history has ever carried the aura Cro Cop did at his peak. Opponents walked into the ring already beaten, staring into the cold eyes of a man who had trained not just for sport, but for war. His highlight reel is a gallery of devastation, the left high kick ending fights in an instant, opponents collapsing in heaps, fans roaring as another victim fell. For years, he was the most terrifying striker alive, but his legacy is also tragedy. His fall in the UFC, his broken body, the surgeries, the stroke, these are not just footnotes. They are part of the story. Cro Cop's life is a reminder of what combat sports truly are: a machine that glorifies violence, that builds myths, and then leaves its heroes broken when the lights go out. Even so, Cro Cop's place in history is secure. He will always be remembered as one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, a pioneer who brought striking mastery into MMA, and a man whose presence defined an era. His induction into the UFC Hall of Fame in 2024 was more than a recognition of his achievements. It was an acknowledgement of his sacrifice. For fans, the memory of Cro Cop will always be a mixture of awe and sorrow. The cold stare, the merciless knockouts, the aura of death, these will never be forgotten. But neither will the image of a 50-year-old man, his body broken, admitting to the dark truth of what fighting cost him. The legacy of Mirko Cro Cop is that of a warrior who gave everything to the fight, and, in the end, paid the ultimate price. He was more than just a fighter. He was a force of nature, a symbol of violence, and a man who became a myth. And like all myths, his story carries both glory and tragedy.